Hello and welcome to Let's Break Bread. I'm Stance, your host, inviting you into a wide-ranging conversation where we untangle everything we thought we knew about bodies, food, and eating disorder recovery. In conversation with guests from all corners of the anti-diet world, we'll dig into what it means to inhabit a body and defend it against a culture obsessed with so-called health and wellness. Whether you're in active ed recovery, tired of chasing hollow, unattainable standards, or just want to hear more about falling in love with life in the body you have now, this podcast is for you. Welcome back to Let's Break Bread. Today we are talking with Laura, who is another eating disorder recovery coach. She's based in Canada. I'm so excited to talk to you, Laura. I don't know a lot about your story. I obviously know you personally and we work together in the coaching community, but I don't know your recovery story, and there's so much about you that I'm so excited to learn. So welcome, Laura.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here and to chat.
Yeah, tell us just a brief introduction, like who you are, what kind of work you do, and then we're going to dive into your own ED recovery story if you're comfortable with that, and then get into some other questions that I have for you. But briefly, who are you and what kind of coaching do you do?
Yes. So my name is Laura Shaw. I live in Ontario, Canada, and I'm an eating disorder recovery and body image coach. So I also provide meal support for clients and do one-to-one coaching. And I see clients in Ontario, across Canada, and then also the US. Yeah, I think that's like, I
Yeah,
guess, a
that's
brief
awesome.
intro. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you brought up meal support too, because I don't think we've talked about that really at all. So that's something we can definitely chat about. And Laura and I know each other through RLC, so that's how we're connected through Jane and Recovery Loving Care. Well, can we talk about your recovery journey and like when that began, what your first memory of diet culture and like where it all went? Just tell a story. I might interrupt you.
Yes. Okay. So we will talk about me being a twin. I know that's something we want to cover, but
Yeah.
I would say my first memory of diet culture, or at least like I have this weird memory. I was at my cottage. I was maybe 7 to 10 years old. I'm not quite sure when. And it was when we had like newspapers were still a thing, and it was black and white newspaper. And I remember my dad reading it, and I looked at one of the pictures. It must have been an Olympic summer year. And I
Okay.
remember seeing this track athlete, like, I don't know what country they were from, but clearly they won something because they were holding a flag. But she had a six pack. And like, I just remember in my brain thinking, oh, I want that one
Okay.
day. I actually
Interesting.
don't know that I've ever really told anyone that story before,
Yeah.
but I find it interesting that my brain just saw that and wanted it without really understanding much about how our bodies change and like what that would involve.
Yeah.
Um, and so growing up, I would say I always had like pretty low self-esteem, definitely struggled with like how I saw my body, and especially compared with a twin. I was we're fraternal, so we aren't identical by any means, but I was sometimes referred to by like other people when they're trying to figure out who's who. I was like the bigger quote unquote twin, and she was the smaller one.
Are there
And
no other ways to describe y'all? Like really the big
well, yeah, so like my family did a good job of not comparing us that way, but I think it was just like with like friends and like teachers and other people, that it just got to this point where like at least what my brain remembers how they described it was like I was bigger and she
Yeah.
was smaller. And like if we went to clothing stores, she was the smallest size, and then I was like the bigger size of like the youth type clothing stores. And so my brain, like I really struggled with feeling like, why am I in a bigger body and why is she smaller, and not knowing how to talk about it or feel comfortable talking about it.
Yeah.
Like it's clearly a thing, but I no one no one addressed this, and that it was okay to be a twin and to look different. Because like I grew up in the age of like the Olsen twin movies and everything, and you're like they're identical, and like that's all I wanted as a twin was to like be able to like switch places with my twin sister and like share clothes. And I couldn't do that. And so that was hard, and I didn't know how to talk about it. So that definitely fueled some of my later development of an eating disorder. But yeah, that was like a big part of being young and struggling with body image.
Yeah, so talking about that newspaper where there's this
Yeah.
Olympian with the six pack,
Yeah.
it's interesting, like it makes sense that your brain would be like, I want that, right? Like not only is it an interesting thing to see on a human body, right? Like just it's just an interesting thing, a six
Yeah.
pack, but also
Yeah.
like this person has a flag and they're being praised and they're a winner, right?
Yeah.
Like they're successful and like being praised. And I don't think we very often see people in bigger bodies being like, what a success story, right? And so
Yeah.
maybe your brain didn't think like abs are this good thing, but this person was a good
Yeah.
thing. And
Yeah.
like the thing that the image that they had projected was this like this one body type.
Yeah.
Um, so that's really interesting that even just seeing that, like, right, no one was saying like you should have these abs, but your brain
Yeah.
was right. This is what successful, good
Looks
people.
like. Yes. 100%. It's so interesting now with like my, recovery adult brain to look at that and just like I have so much compassion for little me in that moment of like not knowing that, yeah, I think I just wanted to be seen and praised, and my twin sister and I were the youngest of four kids. And so I think it's just always this like competition with my
Yeah.
twin sister. Like we've talked about it now as adults a little bit, but it was never like a thing we talked about, but it was like this unknown competition between the two of us of like, as we're growing, like who's taller, right? And
Yeah.
like all of that. And so yeah, I think it was just like, how can I be seen as my own person separate from being a twin?
Totally. And I'm sure that that is true like throughout your life, right? Like,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Are your older siblings boys or girls?
So oldest is older sister. She's 7 years older than myself and my twin. And then we have an older brother who is 3 years older than
Okay.
myself and my twin.
Yeah. And I think probably being the youngest and then your sister being like the little youngest is difficult, right? That sounds like without even being there, that sounds really hard. Like I don't want that sounds
Yeah.
so hard.
Yeah. And it's interesting because as much as like I've looked back and my family, like we had a pretty good, I would say, environment of like with food, like not demonizing food. Like I do remember my mom being on a lot of diets and always trying to lose weight, but we always had full access to food. And so that was never something that like fed into an eating disorder, but I did pick up. It's so interesting also having a twin because I'm like, what do you remember from being a kid? Because
Yeah.
I remember picking up on all of the dieting behaviors and if like my mom ever ate in secret or different things like that. And my other sisters don't remember that. And so it's interesting to
Interesting.
be like, oh, okay, so even though we grew up in the same household at that time, my brain just latched onto these things and her brain was completely unaware of all of that happening. So I
Yeah.
think that's also really interesting to reflect on and how I really like it's proof too for me that like my eating disorder was not a choice and like it wasn't something that I had control over. Like my brain clearly was navigating on its own
Mhm.
towards these areas and it almost just seemed inevitable in a sense without early intervention.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And that you've been able to like talk to your sisters about that too, of like, do you remember this? And they're like, what are you even talking about? Like, that's
Yeah.
not at all what my memory of that was.
Yeah.
It's such a true point, right? Like, I think sometimes we think of eating disorders as being this like sort of like selfish, like a choice to get attention, or like not
Yeah.
we for that, but society
Yeah.
can eating disorders that way. And it's like, man, I had no choice. Like growing up in this society, also my brain was just hardwired to be thinking about that. Like those were the things I noticed. And even if people aren't making direct comments about it, like that's what my brain was picking up on. That's not
Yeah.
your fault, right? But it's I'm sure it took a long time to feel like that wasn't your fault.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It took, until like I probably like the last like 8 years ago probably of like really solidifying recovery that I was like, there really wasn't a way to avoid this in my life with like kind of the trajectory that things went. And I've also been able to like heal that part of like understanding what I've learned through it.
Totally. Yeah, and there's like I mean for me at least, I don't know that I would take back that that's how my life turned out,
Yeah.
right? Like I like the person I am now in this recovery, and if I just like had an easy experience in my body, I don't know who I would be right now.
Yeah.
So, what How did your eating disorder develop, like in puberty, or when did that happen that there was like a shift from sort of having these thoughts about your body to it being an eating disorder?
So I would say, so I wasn't diagnosed until I went away to university in 2010 was my first like fall in university. But in high school, I did cross country running and cross country skiing and track and field. And I noticed there was a shift. So between grade 8 and grade 9, I hit puberty as well. And I remember seeing a family friend who I hadn't seen in a while, and she looked shocked when she saw me because I had lost weight. But
Mm,
I didn't really notice that I had, or I guess it was probably at the end of grade 9, sorry. So after a year of like doing running and skiing and stuff. And so mixed with puberty, that also triggered a bit of a like, oh, I got a reaction
mm,
from my body changing.
yeah. And like
Um,
that attention of like you are uniquely doing something.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I really don't know if at that point I realized that my body had changed that much because it just happens like slowly over a year.
Hmm.
Um, but I would say in high school, I started s- cutting out little things here and there with food, but I always kept it a secret. My eating disorder, all of it was all very much a secret. I didn't let anyone know. So in high school, I felt like I couldn't engage in as many behaviors. Restricting was more up my alley, I guess, of behaviors as well as over exercising. But it was like I could only do so much without my family noticing. And I also had put so much pressure on myself with sports, and I found it as like a really good coping mechanism for like my depression and anxiety that was not diagnosed at that point.
Sure.
That I never engaged in eating disorder behaviors that would go so far to affect my performance.
Mm.
And I don't want that to come across like we have control with those behaviors, but I'd
Okay.
say, yeah, I didn't fully, tip over the edge with an eating disorder until university, but it's definitely disordered in high school. And over exercising was pretty bad.
Yeah, and I think like the idea that like you're like that exercise is a coping skill, right? Like, and an effective, really good coping skill, especially when done in a healthy way, is like
Yeah.
it's a great one, right? Like I absolutely love movement for my mental health.
Yeah.
And it's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And then talking about how you're like, and I controlled my behaviors enough, like
Yeah.
that's not it's not so cut and dry always with our clients, but it is also real that like living at home you had to perform to a certain degree to that like no one would catch on, and then
Yeah.
I'm assuming when you went to college there was more freedom to do whatever you wanted to do because there weren't people making your meals and driving you to sports practices and the
Yeah.
things of high school. uh,
Yeah.
was your twin sister doing sports as well, or was that more of a you thing?
Yeah. We did separate sports though. And that just happened naturally. Like we didn't plan it by any means.
Mhm.
She did like the volleyball, basketball, soccer route. And I think that was like really helpful that we did different sports. I also in high school ended up being diagnosed with a learning disability, but not till grade 12.
Okay.
Um, and so she was also just like naturally a better, not a better student. Um, but school came a bit easier for her
Yeah.
than it did for me. And so it felt like I was like excelling in the sport area and she was excelling in school. Not that I wasn't doing well in school, but
Yeah, but like different strengths, right? Yeah.
yeah. And you come home with your report card and it's, oh, how do you do, Vic? That's my twin sister's name. And then
Mhm.
it'd be like, oh, Laura, how'd you do? And my grades would be lower. And my parents were like, still good job. But I feel like I wasn't meeting the expectation in a sense. But that was my own interpretation of what was
But hard to not feel like that. Like that's the thing I want to talk so much about with twins. Like anyone
yeah.
I talk to, it's like, okay, do you have siblings? How are you compared? What was the
Yeah.
difference? Like because it
Yeah.
happens, right? Like we'll talk to my sister and she's 8 years younger than me, nowhere near twins, right? Like
Yeah.
almost different parenting planes. My parents were in different parts of their lives when they raised us. And at the same time, like we were still compared sometimes. And we're
Yeah.
8 years apart. Like there's no way we could be compared, right? Like
Yeah.
it doesn't even make sense. I was like a full adult while she was in middle school. Like it doesn't make sense that we were compared. But if you're twins, Like, how I feel like the comparison just happens all the time. So I don't know
Yeah.
how you would not feel like your grades were lower, or like that
Yeah.
just seems so difficult, even with the best intentions from your parents.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so then you're applying for colleges. Did you go to different colleges?
No, we actually went to the same one, but that also wasn't planned. We
Interesting.
applied to like a bunch of different ones. I was originally going to go like the kinesiology type route, physiotherapy, athletic sport therapy, whatever.
Yeah.
But my guidance counselor actually was like, okay, so you've applied to all those programs. Why don't you pick one thing that is different? Because I didn't know what I wanted to do.
Sure.
Um, and so she's like, that way you have your bases covered in case you change your mind. So I applied. It was a bachelor's of applied science in child, youth, and family. Um,
Do you have to pick that when you're applying to college?
yeah.
What?
So yeah,
Why what do you mean? How are you
you,
supposed to know?
yeah, you pick the different programs. And my program had the Bachelor of Applied Science had like you could go the nutrition route, child, youth, and family, adult development. So I could have, and you can change once you're in school, your major, but I guess I could have done just like a general bachelor's applied to, but that one did fit my experience because I worked at a summer camp for many years and really loved working with youth. Um, yeah, so we ended up both just happened to accept at the same university, which honestly was a gift. Like I am really grateful that I went to the same school as her. I think my mental health it spiraled anyway, but I think it would have been a lot worse had I been isolated because
Totally.
we really like have always been super close and kind of like our own safety net. Like even now as adults, we still will grocery shop together and like do random chores because we're like it's more fun together than apart. So
Yeah.
so yeah, we went to school. We didn't live together in first year. We had different roommates that were friends from our like hometown as
Okay.
well. So that was really nice to also have like some community.
Yeah.
Um, but then, yeah, things started to spiral a little bit.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So what
Yeah.
about college? Was it like the time in your life, the freedom that you hadn't had before? Did people say things? We talked with Abby about like the danger of saying of warning people about the freshman 15.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Freshman 15 was threatened for sure. And like jokes, which, but you realize it's really not a joke. And it's why are we making comments and like putting this pressure on kids that if their bodies change, it's like the worst thing that could ever happen. Like,
Also like the thing that should happen. Like no one
yes.
should stay the same size as
Yeah.
they were in high school, but we like
No.
recognize it.
Yes. So, yeah, freshman 15 was definitely on our minds for sure. It was freedom around food where they're like I could cope however I wanted. Um, I also had really bad anxiety and my depression also started to spiral as well in first year. So like I just like could not sometimes like leave my dorm room. Like I really struggled outside of like class lectures where like I had the same classes as my roommate. If anything varied from that, it was very difficult for me to leave, but I thought that the anxiety I was feeling was normal and that I was just failing at coping with it. And
I
same with the
so relate
depression.
to that.
Yeah, I
And it's
didn't
so
know.
yeah, because you don't know other people's experience, right? And because we don't talk about it, but like a lot of college students have no issue leaving their dorm room and go to all types of things. But I relate with that with you. Like
Yeah.
yeah, I really get that. And it's so heartbreaking to think like everyone feels this way. I just suck. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I was like, what am I not doing that I can't just go and like have fun and like walk freely? Like I always had these like everything was planned out and took a lot of effort.
Yeah.
And so that's also when in first year I started to have like suicidal thoughts and I was like can distinctly remember being like whoa this isn't me like this is different than the depression and anxiety that I was feeling and I was like what is going on And I had some like friends and stuff that I did confide in about that. Um, but it was definitely a very difficult time to be like so much change and new things and trying to cope with school and like not wanting to fail by any means. And also like I remember teachers in high school just saying, and when you go to university, remember like your grades will be different than what they are in high school. Like you'll probably notice a drop, but that's okay. Like it's not meaning you're like not doing as well. You just have to adapt. But I also took that really hard and I was like, why am I not doing as well
Yeah.
in all of this? And so, and having the learning disability and trying to like access resources was all a
Yeah.
lot. And so, yeah, I was officially diagnosed with depression and anxiety in first year. I don't know when. I know I saw my family doctor like back home in Perry Sound and I started to go on medications, I think that year. Um, or maybe it was a year later.
And was that so? If it was your family doctor, was that a thing that like your parents were aware of and were supportive of you getting that mental health help, or did you feel like you had to be like this independent adult handling it on your own?
Um, they found out that I was struggling. And so it was with like their support that I then started to see a counselor. And so, and like I remember I think my older sister came with me to talk to them and like to my doctor just as a support.
Nice.
And I think that might have been around the time when my eating disorder was diagnosed. I think was like the following summer after first year. Um,
And
and that again was I was working at a summer camp and I had confided in one of the staff. Um, yeah, that I realized the adjustment because all of our meals, it was like a stayover camp type thing. So all of a sudden, all my meals are having to take place at the camp in like a cafeteria. And I was like, did not anticipate how bad
yeah,
my behaviors had become and the restriction and stuff. And so I then had to go home and like talk with my family to let them know so that way I could stay at camp and my family would be aware and I'd be like seeing a counselor as well.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
Okay, so what were the behaviors that you saw in college and in that like in that summer? You talked about restriction a bit. Were there other eating disorder things that came up for you?
So restriction, over exercising continued. But it was also an adjustment of not having sports in my teams. So
Yeah,
that change of like, how do I still engage in exercise in a way that can help me cope, but also feeling the eating disorder voice getting really strong about needing to burn off food and stuff. So those were mostly it was restriction and over exercising. I would I never really struggled with binging, so to speak, but I did feel more out of control with food.
sure.
Like the whole growing up, it was like for me, my family was like, you have to clean your plate, like finish what's on your plate. You know, you can't leave leftovers. So that mentality was still very much there, which was hard in university when portion sizes are just different. And I didn't feel like I could ever leave anything on my plate because I didn't want to waste food. And so
Yeah.
then I feel like I couldn't control my like hunger and fullness as well.
Yeah, I mean anything like a clean your plate mentality or you have to eat the vegetables before you have dessert type of
Yeah.
things that we grew up with like teaches us to ignore what our body is telling us,
Yeah.
right? Again,
Yeah.
well intended. I don't think that food waste is something that should be taken lightly, right? Like
Yeah,
but
for
it
sure.
also has some serious ramifications on our inability to hear what our body is really telling us. And our body's so wise and does know what we need. So that makes sense that those things would you would feel out of control. Like I totally get that. Did your sister or anyone else know about this food stuff, or it was after like when you were at camp, then you had to like come out to them about it?
Basically, it was at camp. I hid it from, I mean, my roommate and my sister, whenever, yeah, everything. I had really figured out how to keep this a secret.
Mhm.
And then when I went to camp, I had to then share everything. And that was really hard because there was a part of me that I was like, there's going to be relief in this, that I'm no longer having this secret that they don't know about, but I also didn't want to be a burden or feel like I had failed them for struggling.
Yeah.
And I also didn't know what to do to keep going at this point. Like I didn't understand how I would manage without them
Yeah.
knowing.
What was your family's reaction when you had that big coming out moment?
Yeah, so my mom had picked me up at camp, and I had packed up a bunch of my stuff, and she was confused because this was like the staff week before campers come, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, did you get kicked out? Like what?"
Yeah, what's
I feel
happening?
some way that's not me at all. Like I'm such a rule follower
Mhm.
that she was just so confused. And so she was like, "Laura, like I can't drive until you tell me what's going on." Cause I was like, "I'll wait," but it's an hour drive back home. And
Yeah.
so she's like, "I honestly can't drive without you telling me what's going on because I'm concerned." So I told her, as like, I'm struggling with um an eating disorder. And
Okay, so you like told her straight up, this is what it is.
yeah, I
Like,
was like, I think I have an eating disorder.
mm.
Um, and what's interesting is she then shared, she was like, I actually, when I was younger, had an eating disorder.
And did you know that, or was that like a shock?
No, that was a shock. And so I honestly don't know if anyone knew in her
Mm,
life. Outside of it, I don't think it was ever diagnosed.
okay.
Not to say that you need a diagnosis,
No.
but I feel like if it was diagnosed, my grandparents would have known because it was when
Sure.
she was around the same age, like a young adult.
Yeah, how
Yeah.
interesting that that was like I when I talked to my mom, I said that I was like shocked that she ever had some of those similar behaviors to me. And
Yeah.
she's like, "What are you talking about?" Like she was like, "How did you not know that?" And I'm like,
Yeah.
"We didn't talk about it." Like we view our
Yeah.
parents as being so knowledgeable and like they can do no wrong, but like they have their own stories and their own hardships. And it's so interesting that she understood that and you
Yeah.
had no idea.
Yeah. And yeah. So then, and that must have been then when I went to my family doctor.
Okay.
And then I was never diagnosed. So my family doctor just said, yeah, you do have an eating disorder, but she never gave me a specific diagnosis. So I didn't receive a specific diagnosis until I went to treatment the first time.
Okay.
Um, but it also is interesting if you're cool if we jump ahead a bit. So in 2012, so after my second year of university, so despite sharing with my family that I had an eating disorder and they knew I had depression and some anxiety, I was trying medications, trying seeing a counselor, and it just wasn't helping. And I don't think the counselor I was seeing also was trained with to handle eating disorders and the extent to which I was like really struggling. Um, and it got like pretty dark that year. And so I pretty much was like going to bed hoping I wouldn't wake up and then waking up in the morning and being like, how do I keep doing this day after day? While still hiding and masking and acting like everything was fine, even though it wasn't. And so um that at the end of that summer, I went to camp again and then went back for my third year university. And I went for my twin sister and I went for like our first day of classes, came home for like Labor Day weekend. It was a weird timing.
Mhm.
And then I actually had a suicide attempt that year, which not many people, I mean, a few people do know, and that's long enough now that I'm comfortable talking about it, but I definitely a wake-up call for my family as well, because as much as they knew these issues were going on, we still weren't talking about it, and I didn't know how to talk about it.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's then what led me to going to treatment the first time.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think you highlight such an important thing of like they knew, we all knew, but we also don't know, right? Like this is not to blame them, but like we don't know how to handle that really. Like there's no guidebook for parents on like, so you find out your child has an eating disorder. Here are the
Yeah,
right steps to take. Someone should make that. That would be
yeah,
great.
that would be helpful.
But yeah, no, they don't know, right? And so like if your mom struggled with food stuff when she was young and was able to kind of work through it, then maybe she thought that that was like what was going to happen for you was like, oh, you're going to this counselor,
Yeah.
like you've done what we need to do. Um, and there was still a lot of pain and still a lot of hurt and like, yeah, and if your counselor didn't know much about eating disorders either, like it makes a lot of sense that you would still be really struggling despite like having told everyone what was going on and like seeing a therapist. Sometimes you need more support than that. And there needs to be a lot more conversations in our family about what that really means and how to
Yeah.
move forward. So I'm really sorry that it took something like a suicide attempt to get the help that you needed, but it also like I think it makes sense. Like your family didn't know better until they knew better, right? And that's
Yeah.
fortunate.
And in one sense, I mean, that suicide attempt did save my life in a roundabout way because um I with my eating disorder, um I wasn't in your stereotypical body for someone struggling with restriction. I was not like super, super thin. And so when I went to treatment, I got the
Like
diagnosis, yeah,
very
of
good.
eating disorder, not otherwise specified, now known as OSFED, um, which just felt like a failure in itself.
Totally.
But I think that's where also the education, like my family didn't know how bad it was because my weight was not showing.
Yeah.
Yes, I had lost weight, and, like, I remember my older sister questioning it at one point and stuff, but it wasn't enough for people to get concerned, I guess, is the way to put it, and this was also so long ago, and so they didn't know any different, and there were no resources really for us, and so, actually, when my parents were trying to figure out where to send me, the city that I went to university in actually had a residential treatment center
Okay.
and reached out to them to see if I would fit. And back then, my BMI wasn't low enough. So I couldn't go to that
Oh,
treatment center. And that really made me feel like I didn't have an eating disorder and that I just like was making things like it really just invalidated everything and made me feel like, oh my gosh, I just am failing again at not able to cope. Maybe what I'm dealing with is actually normal and I'm just not cut out for this, you know? And so then thankfully my family did send me, I went to Chicago. I went out of country to treatment.
wow.
And that's where I got diagnosis of eating disorder not otherwise specified, but was like it's the best thing that could have ever happened, as much as it was a difficult thing to go out of country, and I was there for 7 weeks, but I got help for my depression and my anxiety and for the eating disorder, and I, for the first time, got to learn about, like, the cycle of an eating disorder and, like, why I was engaging in behaviors in response to, like, my emotions. It all made so much sense and, like, was super helpful. Um, yeah, and then I, after 7 weeks, discharged and got to go home and thought it would be a great idea to go to school the next semester.
Oh, right. Well, and I think we also want our life back, right? Like you did the thing, you put in the work, like let me get back to life. And that sometimes is a little too quick.
Yeah.
I do want to note on, I think a lot of people don't know that about eating disorder clinics, that a lot of them, not always in the US, but definitely in the UK, and it sounds like in Canada as well, sometimes you need to have a low enough BMI to qualify for care. And that is doing so much harm.
Yeah.
So much harm. It is wild. I have heard many stories of people going to get treatment, being denied because their BMI wasn't low enough, and making a plan with their family to go home and restrict enough to get to that BMI so they can have that access. And that, like, it breaks my heart. I don't understand. People of all body sizes struggle with eating disorders. People of all body sizes struggle with restriction. It's not just people who are emaciated, but again, the education that we get in schools and then sometimes treatment centers have these really hard lines that are so damaging. So I'm really glad that you were able to go to Chicago. That sounds like it would be hard, but it's also really,
Yeah.
really good that you're able to do that. And it sounds like your treatment experience that first time, I think that you've been more than once, is that right?
Yeah. I have. Yeah.
In that first treatment, that it like it made sense to you and you felt like seen and understood, which is great.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. It was really cool to have. a treatment center that dealt with all of my mental health. Like I felt like I was treated as a whole person, like I was getting help in all the different areas. I mean, I did also feel like a number at that facility because it was a larger facility and that happens. And I think I've learned a lot since of like what treatment could also be more beneficial than what I did. But I think for the situation we were in where I literally did not want to live anymore, it was like we don't have time to wait for anything else. Like
Yeah.
this place will take you. And we had family help pay for it because we had to pay out of pocket because we couldn't get coverage. So
Yeah, because
that
out of
was
country, right?
also
Like that's a whole other
yeah,
thing. Wow. It's amazing that your family was able to pull that together. Like it is
yeah,
really expensive.
yeah.
Really expensive. Like it's if you don't have insurance care, I think there was a bill that I saw that was over $500 a day for an outpatient, intensive outpatient that I went to. $500 a day. Like, and I think that that's what they were billing to insurance. That
Yeah.
wasn't an out of pocket thing, but like how is that accessible?
Yeah,
Even
they
if you're in
had
the country, like how?
yes. They gave I remember they had like an out of country option for
Okay.
people that was like slight like $250 cheaper than what the day rate was. And that also was hard for me. Like I was so grateful, but I also felt so much pressure that my family's paying for this and this needs to work. Like
Yeah.
and as much as like I did get a lot out of it and I learned so much, I also felt so much pressure and didn't also understand the importance of having step down levels of care
Yeah.
and like to go from out of country back into my home, not my hometown, I went back to university, but there weren't programs in place. Nowadays there are a
Yeah.
couple programs I think that you'd be able to get in on, but we couldn't afford to stay in the US to do step down
Oh,
programs. And so I just went back to university. And I did find a therapist on campus with eating disorder experience who I actually still see to this day. I've seen her on and off for the last like 10, 12 years.
wow.
And I'm really grateful for her because I feel like she's seen me through it. But yeah, I didn't have like the dietitian support and I was trying to find a psychiatrist and all of this stuff that was falling on myself and my family when you're just new to like the mental health world of like trying to find support and resources. So
Totally. I can't imagine even just like the coordination of being out of country and then being back in your home country is a lot, right? Like,
yeah.
so wow, that is wild. And then typically we would want someone who leaves residential to go to intensive outpatient and have like you're talking about like this step down of care where like you have high support and then medium support and some lower support and then you feel really independent and you wouldn't want to go from residential to bam back into college, baby.
Yes. Yeah, and thankfully I did go to like part-time. I think full-time was 5 courses. I went down to 3, and because of my learning disability, I was still considered full-time
Okay.
even though it was a lower course load, which that was hard because my friends and my twin sister were at full course load. So I'm like, why can't I do that as well?
It's so hard the comparison because you're dealing with
Yeah.
a whole other host of things that they're not dealing with, but like you don't have the ability in those moments to
Yeah.
think, I'm actually saving my own life right now while
Yeah.
y'all are just existing as teenagers. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
wow. So how was that going back?
It it was like culture shock in a sense. Also because I'm now back living with my sister and 2 friends at university, and my twin sister is having to keep my meds for me and then give them to me every day, which that was recommended from the treatment center. And I honestly don't really remember having a conversation with her. It just happened that way that like she would have the blister packs of my meds. I remember there were nights where like she would go out with friends and my anxiety was so bad and I was tired and like, all the
Sure.
mental health stuff. But I remember I have to be like, hey, like I need my meds for at night. Like, can you come leave your friends right now to come get my meds? Because I don't know where they are. Um, So that was hard too, and I actually don't know that we've talked about that. So now I'm curious to ask her what her experience was like with that. Or if she remembers, maybe she like maybe it didn't
Yeah, maybe
take
it wasn't that
her.
impactful for her, right? But
No,
like,
it might have just, and she's now a doctor.
interesting.
Yeah. So it's really exciting. She's wanted to be a doctor since we were like 4 years old. Like I remember when we were kids playing
Wow.
with like the little doctor set and stuff, and she always wanted to be. So yeah, it was an interesting transition back into school. My therapist was super helpful. I found a psychiatrist to help monitor my meds. But the pressures that I still put on myself in trying to navigate food on my own with friends and people I live with who are like exercising freely and like
Mm,
eating all these different things and feeling like I still had to complete my meals, like my what's on my plate, but my sister didn't have to. That was also really hard
mm,
of this like double standard in a sense. So it was a tricky transition. And I think for about 2 years, I put on the front that I was managing well. And honestly, I slowly was starting to slip back into it over those 2 years. I just was hiding it because I didn't want to let my family down. They spent a lot of money and time, and yeah, I didn't want to be a burden again or feel like a failure.
yeah, when it wasn't, I mean, I hear you and I get like makes so much sense. And like,
Yeah.
even if like if you're struggling, you're not, that's okay. Like you're not a burden, right?
Yeah.
Man.
And it's interesting too because my family would tell me that I'm not a burden and not, but my brain was just so stuck in this place of feeling that way. And I mean, that was my depression,
Sure.
that not being able to find medications that helped and stuff. So it was really battling a bunch of different mental health
Yeah.
stuff at
Well, it's
once.
hard to think like I need all the support and no one else does, right? Like
Yeah, that
I'm
was also hard as a twin. Um, Another layer of comparison of she is not struggling with any of these things, which is great. I'm glad.
Mhm.
And why am I the one that is struggling with all of these things when, nothing was different in her life?
Yeah. Yeah. Have y'all talked about that now as like adults who have like processed these things, or do you kind of keep it separate?
That's actually a good question. I think we've like over the years talked about it, not like super intensely, just like lightly. Um, but I don't even think we really talk much about it. I think it's just kind of, yeah, I actually don't think we have.
Yeah, that's allowed, right? Like I think it would, if I would talk to my sister too much about like how I think her version of my parents was the better version, which is like not the same thing, but
Yeah,
I do
yeah.
think like they really grew up in those 8 years between us.
Yeah.
And like she just had a completely different version of our parents than me. And sometimes I can get into this mindset where I'm like, that's so unfair. Like how come she got this like really evolved version of the two of them and she got this and that, and it was so, and like she's not maybe the person to talk to about that. It's not her
Yeah.
fault. Like it's, I talk to that with my therapist and maybe with my husband, but like she doesn't need to know that sometimes I feel like that's really unfair.
Yeah.
Shout out to Gus, now you're gonna know to this my
Yeah.
part. And so like I get why that would be kind of a strange thing to talk to
Yeah.
in a deep way with her.
Yeah.
Nothing.
I would say, I guess recently, now that as we're talking about it, we have had a couple conversations because my mental health is still something evolving and trying to find treatment for stuff when you have treatment resistant depression is tricky. So she has addressed how it's a difficult that I am struggling with this stuff and she is having a very different life
Yeah.
um, than what I am. However, I am grateful like that we have that relationship and the support.
Yeah. Totally. Okay. So now did you finish college? And then,
Yeah, well, okay, so then um 2 years later, my mom got breast cancer or was diagnosed with breast cancer. Okay, it was either 2013 or 2014. I can't actually remember. I think it was 2014 that she was diagnosed, and then during the summer, she did chemotherapy, and I worked at summer camp. And my twin sister was home along with my older sister. I and my brother, I was either home or somewhere working, like in a different city. I can't remember. But 2014 is actually when I then relapsed in the fall, because all of my friends graduated in the spring of 2014, which I was really excited for them, but I also felt very much left behind. And how do I now cope with having to meet new friends as an adult? And like, I'm now in different classes and I don't know anyone in those classes. And so that was a big adjustment too, of like figuring out what to do when, literally my whole world just graduated and is off doing
Yeah.
these amazing adventures. And I'm still trying to figure out school.
It
Plus
feels
my
like the end
mom.
of the world to me. I graduated a year later than everyone else because of I paused for treatment
Yeah.
and like it I truly I remember even posting on social media like is it weird that I'm graduating later than everyone else? And now like do you ever meet someone as a grown up and you're like, what year did you graduate? How quick
Yeah.
did you finish college? Like, no, it never matters,
Yeah.
right? But like in the moment, it feels really like you have yet again, you've fucked it up, you failed.
Yeah.
Everyone else is out on their own doing their thing, and you're like still here.
Yeah. And I did grad photos with my sister and her friends because you could pay to get it like done as a group.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to be a part of that. So I did that. And I had only like another year left, I think, because I'd been doing part-time, so my courses didn't all line up.
Mhm.
But I ended up having my undergrad overall took about 9 years to finish, but I took many semesters off in between because of my eating disorder needing treatment, and then also with my mom having cancer.
Yeah, totally. I
Um,
mean, all very reasonable reasons for that
yeah.
time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, and it's interesting because it really felt like at that time, like people would judge me for like not being done school in like your 4 or 5 year time frame. But now I'm like, it makes total sense. And I'm really glad that I took the time I needed to finish. And then when I did finish, I'm probably gonna get emotional. I feel it right now.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
it was after my mom had passed, so we can kind of go back in time a little bit, but my dad was there. Whew. And
Okay.
it
This
was,
is heavy stuff. This is a lot.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was a really cool moment to have graduated, and my therapist actually was able to be there as well, uh,
Hmm.
to have them there, and I know how proud they were
And
that,
your mom too, right? Like she's so
that-
and it's so like to take the time and to be present with your mom and like and then you still graduated, dude. Like you
yeah,
did
I
that,
know.
right? Like
I was so proud.
it's yeah, and you should be. Like that's incredible and it makes so much sense. And I think sometimes like our eating disorders or the perfectionist in us would be like, just power through, just get it done, right? But like taking time so you can spend time with your mom, like
Yeah.
that's incredible. Yeah. Oh man, I'm sorry. That is heavy and hard, but it is really impressive, and I'm really glad that you were able to have like a happy grad moment.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about losing your mom and what that was like. I feel like I'm gonna get emotional because the idea of losing my parents is my
Yeah.
actual worst nightmare. Like
Yeah.
I can't even think about it without crying. So yeah, I want to hear about what that was like and like yeah, how that impacted your healing and more. Just tell me about that.
Yeah. So do we also want to talk? I went to treatment a second time.
Yeah, sure. Wherever you want to
It
go. Like,
all it all kind of overlaps a bit. So 2014, I had relapsed and I actually finished that one semester and then told my family I need more help. Like I
yeah,
can't keep doing this.
yeah.
And that I had relapsed. So I moved home at Christmas and then started looking for treatment programs.
Okay.
And we couldn't go out of country again. So we were looking for within province of Ontario. And so there were some outpatient hospitals or day hospital programs. So I was on like a 6 month wait list for that. And so I was at home living with my family trying to
Stay alive.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then that spring, it was 2015, I did 11 weeks of outpatient
Okay.
in hospital, which was helpful for the eating disorder. It got me back being able to complete meals and like eat consistently, but it also um we had to track our movement, like even walking. And so that was really triggering because it was reinforcing that like just walking was a form of exercise for the eating disorder. And actually remember the psychiatrist saying, like, if you ever exercise again, you'll relapse. And like, I had a really hard time with that. I know we're jumping around a bit.
It's totally fine. I just what a wild suggestion. Like,
I know. It
no,
was,
inaccurate.
I know. And so that actually really affected my relationship with exercise. And because I used to overexercise, it was hard anyway. But then hearing those words, my brain really stuck with that. And it took about 6 years for me to be able to exercise again without this fear, because all of a sudden the eating disorder went to you can't exercise because you will
Mhm.
relapse. And
Yeah.
it like wasn't restricting food anymore, but I was restricting exercise because of this fear of really,
Yeah.
even though it was in a sense still an eating disorder behavior. But yeah, I went to treatment and I didn't get the support for my depression and anxiety, but I got the support for the eating disorder. So then I went back to school after the 11 weeks and continued with school. That was, yeah, 2015 in the fall. And then my mom's cancer came back in the fall of 2016. And at that point, it was everywhere in her body and her brain and stuff. And so we knew that it was just a matter of time. And so after the fall semester of 2016, I took time off from school and I moved home.
Yeah.
And my
Just spend
sisters were
time.
there as well. Yeah, we just got, I mean, we didn't know how long we would have, but we ended up having just under a year from when we found out the cancer was back to when she passed. And so that time, I mean, was a roller coaster because she almost died in that time span as well, like twice,
Yeah.
due to complications with some like radiation that she did and medication. But um, it was really nice to have that time with my mom, but it also was hard because I still wasn't in a place where I could openly talk about my recovery and struggling with food. And I knew that she was worried that her cancer coming back would lead me to relapse.
Mm.
And I didn't want her to worry that I was going to relapse, but we
Right.
weren't talking about it. It was like this weird situation. And so I knew once the cancer was back, I was like, I need to show my mom this year that like I'm going to be okay. And
Mm.
that's making me emotional as well.
Yeah.
So I really, in a sense, was almost faking it at times with food, like really trying so hard with recovery to continue eating my meals and not overexercise and like show my mom that like I was going to be okay.
Yeah.
And eventually through that, I have been recovered ever since. But it was definitely, looking back, I do wish I could have had more open conversations, but I also understand that I wasn't in a place where I felt like I could have those conversations with my mom.
Yeah, and I mean, it's in hindsight, we can think like two
Yeah,
things could have existed at the same
yeah,
time, but it
yeah,
totally makes sense to me why you would feel like to show her that you're gonna be okay, but also that like she has enough to deal with right now, right? Like that it's hard to I feel like if my mom has a cold, I wouldn't want to bring something to her. So
yeah,
like okay, so you're back at home spending time with your mom, and that, I mean, it makes sense why it would be kind of performative recovery and trying to just like stay alive and exist and have this time with your mom.
yeah.
And then as she passed, what was that like for you in your mental health journey?
Yeah, it was, um, my mind just blanked. Okay. It was, it was really hard. That whole year brought my family closer together. Like we've always been a close, like immediate family.
Mhm.
But definitely that year we really grew closer together despite the stress of all of it. And so we I continued with therapy through all of that. I honestly think that was like my saving grace in a sense that I was able to see my therapist and get the help that I needed. I still had my psychiatrist. I never had a dietitian outside of treatment programs, which I think in hindsight, if I'd found someone that was like anti-diet haze aligned would have been really cool. But that was hard to come by at the time.
Totally.
So
I mean, even still, I don't think I've ever worked with a dietitian that is that way until I had the conversation with Abby, and I was
yeah,
like, "This is incredible. There
yeah,
are people who believe this." Like
yes,
it's still
yeah,
incredible. So yeah.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean I went back to school, I think in the she passed away in October of 2017. So yeah, I think I went back to school in January, just like one course.
Hmm.
And I was living back in the city where I went to school with some friends, or with a friend. And I had like a really good support network of friends, which was really great. And I think that was what was super helpful of like maintaining recovery and like knowing what I needed to do to keep moving forward. And I knew that like I'd been down the road of relapse. I've been down the road of like trying to be the smallest version of myself or like cope in those ways and it never did it. It didn't work. And so I was like I need to find a way that's different and what is going to be different is sticking with recovery longer than the 2-year mark that I had been with before. Um so I really was like, how do I get past this 2-year mark? How do I keep moving forward? And so I actually worked with a dietitian who launched, they had like a intuitive eating breakup with diet, like you walk through the principles type thing. And it was like self-paced. And that was really helpful because I was at a point where I was like, how do I tune into like my hunger and fullness? And like,
Yeah.
how do I have like gentle nutrition and I think what's interesting too is like the more I fed my body of everything it wanted, the more I think I had this fear of like, oh, people are going to think because I eat intuitively, I'm only going to eat sweets or
Sure.
like, or ultra processed foods. But really, it's like, no, your body, like my body, but would crave vegetables and it would crave fruit, like it
Right.
would crave all the foods because
Right.
I was allowing all food. And so that was helpful. To kind of explore that side of food nutrition and how I can listen to my body and like I think a lot of my treatment was focused on like understanding concepts and like I was still very detached from my body and like feeling what it was like to like be in my body. And so
Yeah.
that was a big part as well of healing the food while I like reconnected with my body basically. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a whole different side of recovery, right? Like
Yeah.
there's like this clinical recovery part where you're like you stop using symptoms and you start to like be if you're weight restoring or you're eating your meals or and then the other part is like and then what? Like what does
Yes.
life look like if we're not dieting and we're not being controlled by this other part of us?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. I know for you, a big part of your recovery is like broader mental health. It's not just an eating disorder story, it's a bigger mental health journey, and that it's still something you're working on. How does that feel? Like we talked a bit about feeling like a burden or feeling like other people are recovering so quickly or like not wanting to have to do it again. And
Yeah.
really, like mental health work is a lifelong thing,
Yeah.
right? But does it still feel sometimes like you still need more support and other people don't need it? Is that still something that you struggle with in this journey?
It is, but not as intensely. I would say like my mental health journey is yeah, still ongoing, still continuing to choose new treatments and like I feel like I as I continue to try like new medications or like experimental type treatment things, it's like a reminder that I'm choosing to live and
Oh
choosing
yeah.
recovery and like not just giving up. And so having a supportive family, which I know is definitely a privilege not everyone has been super helpful.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the broader mental health, I think, has like complicated things, and it's been hard to feel like I'm the only one in my family dealing with this. And yet, I also then get to have a lot of support from people who have capacity to provide the support when if they were as well dealing with these things, we wouldn't necessarily be able to support each other the same way.
Yeah. And I love the idea of reframing that of like that you are continuing to choose life and
Yeah.
recovery and like the fullest version of life, right? Like when I was a teacher, I told my students all the time that I'm not very impressed by students who just do well in school. Like they're just like your sister. No offense to your
Yeah.
sister. My sister too. That's how
Yeah.
she is. She's just like really naturally good at school, likes it, doesn't have the social part that's difficult for me. Like
Yeah.
she's just like thriving. Like
Yeah.
that's actually not that impressive to me. I think
Yeah.
it's kind of boring. Whereas a student who like maybe doesn't like school or finds it really difficult or learns in a different way, like that is so much more impressive to me that they keep at it and that like you have I think a more difficult mental health journey than I did in my own recovery, and I love that you said that like you get to just keep choosing life. That's incredible and way more impressive than someone to me who like goes to treatment, is healed, and lives on their beautiful life,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
good for them.
Yeah.
Ew. I love that like you're resilient, right? Like you are continuing to choose life. There are ways that you could have chosen to continue to live a smaller life, and instead, like you keep at it. And that is just, I love that about you. And I love that you're like so willing to try new different things and be creative about what recovery looks like. I think that's really impressive. So I really appreciate that reframe.
Thank you. I know. I honestly think it just like kind of clicked within the last couple of years of realizing like, oh, I am still choosing like recovery and to live and to like I'm not settling for this smaller life of what could exist if I stopped trying in a sense to like have a full life. And so and that's what like doing the recovery coaching with RLC helped me see as well is that like I can adapt what it would look like to be a recovery coach to also fit my life and my health and what works for me that's outside of like what might be normal 9 to 5 for people. And
Yeah.
so I think that's really cool is seeing how I can work as I've worked on like my own internalized ableism and like figured out that like it's okay that I don't fit the mold of what my other siblings might be able to do, but like I can still have an impact and like share my story and be a coach while also supporting other areas of having balance in my life.
Yeah. Hell yeah. That's awesome. I love that. I also think it probably impacts the type of coach that you are and the type of clients that you see. So who would you say is like a good fit to work with you, or who is your ideal client?
I I mean, if you were to look on my website, it's like 14 plus, like pretty much anyone who's struggling, right? But I really like young adult seems to be like a really good fit. I kind of love like the university
Mhm.
like just before, just after time span seems to be like a really good fit. And I think because of my lived experience of dealing with an eating disorder throughout that time, I can really understand what clients can be going through, as well as the piece of like other mental health areas and taking that holistic approach of like, okay, we can be working on the eating disorder, but if we're also not caring for these other areas, you're
Mhm.
really not going to find the recovery you're looking for unless we're able to look at all aspects. And that's not to say that I work with the depression or anxiety or other mental health issues, but let's make sure that your team is supporting all areas and not just the eating disorder because it's not going to get you necessarily to where you want to be, at least from my own experience.
Yeah. So like if I were to have a client come to me that is has depression, I worry that my suggestions might not be as aware of that. I am someone who has never once struggled with depression. I'm an incredibly anxious individual and I have OCD and I understand that. But
Yep.
I think I might make suggestions that don't feel very trauma informed or depression informed, or like they might do more harm than good because I haven't had that experience. Whereas
Yeah.
someone like you, you're not doing therapy for depression,
Yeah.
but you know what that's like and you can get it and you can relate to that. And as a coach, I think that lived experience is so important. It doesn't mean I can't work with someone who struggles with depression, but if it's something that's like a big part of their story, I would refer to you because I want them to have someone who really gets it. Right. Similarly, I think like someone who is eating disorder informed but is not an ally might not be someone that I suggest a queer person work with because they might
Yeah.
make suggestions that feel really out of pocket, right? So I think like that lived experience really matters. And yeah, you can work with people 14 up every
Yeah.
quarter, and I think you're very well trained to do that.
Yeah.
But I think using that superpower of your lived experience and you've had multiple rounds of like fighting for yourself is going to really draw clients who need that, and that's
Yeah.
a really incredible offering that you have.
Thank you. Yeah. I think it's cool. It's like tuning into what is more second nature for each person, right? And like, yeah, I could see clients that have different experiences. And of course, we can be compassionate and empathetic and understanding and like be good listeners and whatnot. But I think, yeah, finding coaches that have similar lived experience can just be that much better of
Totally.
like a connection piece. And so that's what I love having other coaches like to refer to, because I'm not going to be the right fit for everyone,
Totally.
but the clients that I am a good fit for, I think it just makes that coaching experience that much better. Like you can just really celebrate those wins from knowing how difficult it really is for those clients.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. Wow. Awesome. Well, if people want to connect with you, where can they find you?
Yes, so I'm on Instagram. Laura Shaw Coaching is my name for that. And then my website is laurashawcoaching.com. That's my main site. There's other socials, but I'm mostly present on Instagram.
Yeah. And then people who are in person can connect with
Oh,
you as
yes.
well.
Yes, I totally forgot. Yeah, so in person in Perry Sound, I am doing work through Thrive Health and Athletics. And so I see clients in person there at their office. Um, and then as well in others of Ontario, it will just be virtual.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for making time to be here. I'm really happy to finally know your story and a little bit more about you. I really appreciate your vulnerability and talking about difficult stuff, but I think it is so valuable. And I'm really, really grateful.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.